Barrett Lynn Beck was born on the 12th of April, 1972, in the small town of Sturtevant, Wisconsin. It was a quiet, peaceful place where, as locals said, nothing much ever happened, neither good nor bad. Life there was slow-paced, crime rates were low, and the town was a popular choice for families with children. Barrett lived in Sturtevant with her parents and her younger brother. She attended the local school, had plenty of friends, and was well-liked because of her warm personality. One of her biggest passions was music. She played the violin in her school orchestra. In high school, Barrett started dating a boy named Kurt, and their relationship continued after they both graduated. By the summer of 1990, Barrett was 18 and thinking about her future. She planned to go to college but hadn't settled on a career just yet, exploring different options. One thing was certain, they all had something to do with music. In the meantime, Barrett got herself a job to save up some money before college. She started working at the office of a pretty big company. And in July of that year, she was set to attend a 3-day seminar to learn how to work on computers. This was a big deal for Barrett. Just a few weeks out of high school, she now had to travel to another city called Appleton, hundreds of miles away from her home, all on her own. At first, Barrett's parents weren't too thrilled about the trip. They were naturally worried about their daughter traveling such a long distance alone and spending a few days in another city. But eventually they came around. They knew she was an adult now, and the seminar was an important part of her job. On the morning of the 17th of July, they gave her the family van, helped her pack for the trip, and saw her off as she hit the road. Barrett's father, Dave Beck, vividly recalled their last interaction. As she was leaving, she said with a smile, "Don't worry, Dad. All the people up north are good people." Her brother, Ben Beck, unknowingly uttered his last goodbye. Barrett had promised to call her parents as soon as she checked into her hotel, but as the hours went by, there was still no word from her. Her parents, already nervous about the trip, grew even more worried, especially since the drive to the city should have only taken a couple of hours. By evening, they decided to call the hotel, only to find out that Barrett had never checked in. Desperate for answers, they started reaching out to her coworkers, friends, and anyone else who might have seen her that day. But no one had. Despite all this, her parents clung to hope. They thought maybe she changed her plans, checked into another hotel, or stayed with someone she knew. They decided to wait until morning, hoping for good news. But when the seminar started and Barrett didn't show up, they knew something was wrong and decided it was time to call the police. The police department got involved, but initially, they didn't do much. They just put out a notice with a description of her van. Barrett was an adult, and there wasn't any clear evidence of foul play, so they decided to hold off on launching a full-scale search and just wait. The day went by with no word from Barrett. She didn't contact her parents or show up at the seminar. The police also weren't able to locate her van, leaving everyone in limbo. The next day brought no developments either until the 19th of July. That's when the police received a tip about a van matching the description parked near a supermarket in the small town of West Bend, about 65 miles from Barrett's home. Officers quickly confirmed that it was indeed her family's van and began examining it for clues. The van's doors were locked, and there was no sign of Barrett inside or anywhere near. The first thing officers found was a receipt from a Walgreens located just across the street from the parking lot. The timestamp showed it was issued on the 17th of July, the day she disappeared. When police spoke with the employee, they confirmed that Barrett had stopped by around noon. She was alone, seemed in good spirits, and her behavior raised no concerns. However, some other findings in the van painted a more troubling picture. The radar detector and stereo were missing, suggesting a possible robbery. But this was just the beginning. The van's interior was littered with cigarette ash, a lot of it. Given that Barrett had never smoked, it was clear someone else had been in the van, and judging by the amount of ash, they'd spent a considerable amount of time there. Then there were her belongings. Almost everything Barrett had taken with her was still in the van. Her red shirt, the one she was wearing when she left home, was on the floor, but part of it had been torn. The dress she'd planned to wear to the seminar was also there, along with her stockings, which had been tied into a knot. Even the shoes she had worn when she left were still inside. One more detail stood out to investigators. Before Barrett's parents handed over the van, they recorded the mileage because her company had promised to cover her travel expenses. But when the police checked the odometer, they noticed an extra 461 miles. Considering it was only about 65 miles from her home to the parking lot, someone had driven the van much farther before leaving it there. Another clue pointing to someone else's presence in the van was the discovery of a couple of disposable coffee cups, one from McDonald's and the other from Burger King. Considering Barrett had likely driven only about 65 miles before something happened to her, detectives doubted she would have stopped at two different places for coffee. These details led investigators to suspect that Barrett might have been abducted or that someone had stolen her van. However, the second theory seemed unlikely. She had been out of contact for several days, and there was still no trace of her whereabouts. The police tried to piece together a timeline of Barrett's last known movements and reconstruct her route. They discovered that she didn't head out immediately after leaving home. Her first stop was to visit her boyfriend Kurt. He told investigators that they talked for a while, discussed her upcoming trip and seminar, and then she left. Kurt said he hadn't heard from her since, and police found no evidence to suggest he was somehow involved in her disappearance. However, detectives did find something interesting. Kurt had given Barrett a fairly expensive ring, which she reportedly never took off. Yet, during the inspection of the van, the ring was found under one of the floor mats. Its placement suggested it had been intentionally hidden there because it seemed unlikely that it could have simply fallen off of her finger and ended up under the mat by accident. If the ring had been removed by an unknown perpetrator, it raised another question. Why would someone steal the radar detector and stereo, but leave behind a valuable piece of jewelry? Meanwhile, forensic experts completed a thorough examination of Barrett's van and found dozens of fingerprints inside. Police asked her friends and family members to provide their prints so they could rule them out, leaving behind a few unidentified prints. These included fingerprints on a coffee cup, the inside of one of the windows, and on the boxes of cosmetics Barrett had purchased at Walgreens. But without a suspect to compare them to, these prints didn't help move the case forward. While the police continued to look for new leads, Barrett's family organized an extensive search effort. They brought in over 100 volunteers, gave interviews to local news stations, and combed through hundreds of miles along the route Barrett was supposed to take. On top of that, they raised $75,000 as a reward for any information about her whereabouts. Over the following weeks, detectives received several tips, but none of them led to a breakthrough in the case. This went on for over a month until the 22nd of August, when the police received a call. A local farmer was driving down a rural road about 18 miles from where Barrett's van had been found. He noticed something unusual in a ditch along the side of the road and decided to take a closer look. To his horror, he realized it was a human body and reported it to the authorities. Officers arrived on the scene and confirmed that the remains belonged to a woman. However, due to the advanced state of decomposition, it was impossible to visually identify her. Still, detectives suspected it could be Barrett, and a comparison with her dental records soon confirmed their worst fears. Because of the condition of the body, medical examiners couldn't determine a specific cause of death. They suggested that the victim might have been strangled. But one thing was certain: this was a murder. Beyond the obvious evidence pointing to foul play, there was one particularly chilling detail. A piece of fabric from Barrett's red shirt was tied around her head, covering her eyes like a blindfold. This suggested she had been kidnapped and likely held alive for some time, although this probably didn't last long. According to the medical examiner's report, the body had been lying in the ditch for over a month. This led investigators to believe that the killer murdered her on the same day she was abducted. Unfortunately, the discovery of Barrett's body didn't bring investigators any closer to solving the case. Months passed without any major breakthroughs. Detectives interviewed multiple suspects, searched for new evidence, and followed every lead, but each one led to a dead end. Investigators assumed Barrett may have been the victim of a robbery gone wrong. They believed that when she parked near the Walgreens and went inside, someone broke into her van. The intruder might have planned to steal valuables and leave, but when Barrett came back and caught them in the act, things took a darker turn. Fearing being caught, the person may have decided to abduct her, later killing her and dumping her body in a roadside ditch. Adding to this theory was the van's odometer. After Barrett vanished, the van had been driven for nearly 500 miles, much more than the distance from her home to where it was abandoned. This suggests that her killer spent a lot of time driving the van before ultimately leaving it behind. Since robbery was considered the prime motive, police began focusing on individuals known for similar crimes. Before long, they zeroed in on a man named Craig, who was suspected of stealing several vehicles not far from the area where Barrett was last seen. What caught investigators' attention was Craig's pattern. He often used stolen cars to commit other crimes and drove them for some time before abandoning them. Behavior that aligned with the movements of Barrett's killer. Detectives started digging into Craig's possible involvement and discovered something interesting. Shortly after Barrett's disappearance, he had been arrested for an armed bank robbery. During his arrest, authorities found a bag in his possession. Among its contents was a woman's hairbrush with blonde hair tangled in it. Unfortunately, in those days, DNA testing wasn't as advanced as it is now. Without the ability to compare the hair to Barrett's DNA, police couldn't definitively link the brush to the victim. Investigators also learned that Craig theoretically had the opportunity to commit the crime, but this fact alone wasn't enough to prove his guilt. However, soon after, detectives received a lead that completely shifted the direction of the case. During interviews with Craig's acquaintances, one of his friends suddenly revealed that Craig had confessed to killing Barrett. Not only that, but he allegedly showed him her body inside the van before disposing of it. The revelation made detectives take Craig even more seriously as their prime suspect. But there was one major issue. His fingerprints didn't match any of those found in Barrett's van. Craig also denied any involvement, leaving investigators scrambling for a way to prove his connection to the crime. Over the following months, they searched for new evidence, but nothing concrete came to light. At one point, police considered formally charging Craig with Barrett's murder, hoping that the testimony from his friend would be enough to secure a conviction. However, they ultimately decided that without strong evidence, the prosecution wouldn't stand a chance in court. Despite this, Craig remained the prime suspect, and for years after, detectives continued their efforts to uncover any new leads to prove his involvement. Unfortunately, this went on for decades, without any serious progress. As her father Dave Beck expressed, "In the case, it's been a nightmare since the day it happened." Everything changed when in 2013, this case was handed to a cold case unit for a fresh review under the leadership of Fond du Lac County Sheriff Mylan Fink. As detectives began going through the old files and evidence, they encountered a frustrating setback. Some of Barrett's clothing, which was supposed to be stored as evidence, was missing, even though it was listed in the official records. The team couldn't track it down, and it appeared that someone, likely an officer, had mistakenly discarded those items. Despite this, investigators sent the remaining evidence to the lab for analysis and requested a new comparison of the fingerprints on file. To their shock, they discovered that in the 23 years since the murder, the fingerprints had never been digitized and were still only stored on paper. Shortly after the prints were uploaded into the database, the lead detective received a call from the lab. The analyst had found a match. 5 of the fingerprints from the van belonged to a man named Dennis Brantner. This name had never come up in the case files before. Police quickly learned he had an extensive criminal record, which is how his fingerprints ended up in the database. In his younger years, Dennis served time for stealing cars and was later arrested for breaking into someone's home. In another disturbing incident, he snuck into a hotel room where a woman was staying, stole her underwear, and left some notes with inappropriate content behind. But one particular episode caught the detective's attention because of its eerie parallels to Barrett's case. Dennis once broke into his ex-wife's car while she was at work and waited for her return. When she got in, he pulled a knife and tried to kidnap her. Fortunately, she managed to escape and reported him to the police. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that at the time of Barrett's murder, Dennis was working as a long-haul truck driver in the same area. His job regularly took him through countless towns and cities, giving him plenty of opportunities to commit such a crime. Still, police wanted to be cautious before jumping to conclusions. First, they confirmed that Dennis didn't know Barrett or anyone in her family, which might have explained the presence of his fingerprints in their van. But there was one key detail they couldn't ignore. One of Dennis's fingerprints was found on a box of cosmetics Barrett had purchased just minutes before she vanished. This meant he had been in the van at that exact time, significantly increasing suspicions against him. The investigators decided to confront Dennis and visit his home. Dennis began denying any involvement in Barrett's murder and insisted he had never met her. However, when the detectives mentioned that his fingerprints had been found in her van, his demeanor changed drastically. Dennis became visibly nervous, occasionally breaking into tears as he answered their questions. But despite this, he continued to maintain his innocence, prompting the detectives to dig deeper for more evidence. When they interviewed people who knew Dennis, they uncovered several intriguing details. His ex-wife mentioned that Dennis always preferred Burger King, which he frequented regularly. In contrast, Barrett preferred McDonald's. And as we remember, investigators had found coffee cups from both fast food chains in Barrett's van, and Dennis's fingerprint was on the Burger King cup. Next, the detectives spoke to Dennis's former co-workers, which led to an even more startling discovery. After Barrett's murder, Dennis had briefly worked at a factory. 3 of his colleagues recalled that he kept a photo of a young blonde woman in his toolbox during that time. Unfortunately, after so many years, it was impossible to determine whether the woman in the photo was Barrett, but the co-workers noted a strong resemblance. Another former co-worker shared a chilling story. Dennis had once told her that he wanted to kidnap and assault her. While the police continued gathering evidence, they received crucial updates from the lab. Despite the earlier loss of some of Barrett's belongings, several items from her van remained in storage, including a cigarette pack wrapper. Using modern forensic tools, investigators found a new fingerprint on it, one that also belonged to Dennis. The collection of all this evidence and information took nearly a year. In March 2015, Dennis Brantner, then 61, was finally arrested and charged with first-degree murder in Barrett Beck's death. Bond was set at $1 million cash, and he remained in the Fond du Lac County Jail. Sheriff Fink described the case as a bold, stranger abduction. Brantner's first trial began in the summer of 2016. But there was a significant challenge. While Dennis's fingerprints were found in the victim's vehicle, the prosecution feared this might not be enough for a conviction. By 2015, public perception had shifted to view DNA evidence as the gold standard in criminal cases. Unlike DNA, fingerprints did not establish a direct link to the murder itself. For instance, it was possible Dennis had been in the van under some other circumstances, leaving room for doubt about his involvement in the murder. Despite extensive forensic efforts, they couldn't find DNA samples linking Dennis to Barrett, her belongings, or her vehicle. During the trial, Dennis's defense lawyer capitalized on the lack of conclusive evidence, arguing that fingerprints alone did not definitively prove his guilt. Eventually, this argument raised enough doubt among the jurors that they were unable to reach a unanimous verdict, and the process ended in a mistrial. For Barrett's family, the situation was agonizing. For 26 years, they had no idea what had happened to her. And now, they had to watch as the man police firmly believed was responsible for her murder escape punishment. Despite this setback, the prosecution quickly announced their intention to prepare for a retrial. The second trial was scheduled for early 2018, but it came with its own set of challenges. The prosecution argued that Dennis attacked Barrett with the intent to assault her before murdering her, but proving his intentions beyond a reasonable doubt was even more difficult. The severity of his potential sentence depended directly on this argument, leaving the prosecution in a precarious position. If they failed to convince the jury of his guilt, Dennis could not be tried for the crime again and might walk free. After lengthy deliberations and consultations with Barrett's family, the prosecution reached a painful compromise. They decided to offer Dennis a plea deal. He would plead guilty to second-degree reckless homicide. This ensured that he would go to prison, though for a significantly shorter time, and the case would finally be considered solved after 28 long years. After consulting with his lawyer, Dennis accepted this deal, and he was sentenced to the maximum possible term, 10 years in prison. With the time he had already spent in jail since his arrest, his total prison sentence was basically just 7 years. It meant that Dennis would be released at the age of 71. Barrett's parents, understandably, were upset by the lenient sentence, but they understood that without accepting the deal, there was a very strong possibility that Dennis would escape punishment entirely. For this reason, They reluctantly supported the plea agreement, fearing they might lose the only chance to achieve at least some justice. Her mother, Diane Beck, simply stated, "Lots of thought, lots of anger." Ben Beck, her brother, reflected on the brutal nature of her death. This was a slow, horrible torture that no family should have to endure. To honor Barrett's memory and keep her spirit alive, her parents established a scholarship at her high school, awarded for excellence in music, which exists to this day. It is also worth noting that decades later, police managed to disprove the testimony against Craig, the first suspect in the case. As we recall, one of his acquaintances claimed that Craig had shown him Barrett's body in her van, but this turned out to be a lie. It turns out this person had a personal issue with Craig and had used information he overheard from the police to frame him. The identification and conviction in the Barrett Beck case serve as a powerful example of how forensic science and persistent dedication can ultimately bring answers and a degree of peace to families, even after decades of agonizing uncertainty.